Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, depending on the time zone you're in. It is a pleasure to welcome you for this third edition of the series of webinars on infrastructure and public procurement responses to the crisis. This webinar is about strategic planning of infrastructure as a means to support the recovery phase in countries. I will first start by a few housekeeping remarks, just to signal you that you can use the chat function to ask questions to the panelists. The panelists are invited to raise hand, and I will call on them on the order of the hand raised. You can also use to ask questions the social media using the hashtag OECD Infra. Finally, the meeting is recorded to allow for it to be reviewed. I will briefly walk you through the structure of this webinar. The session will start by opening remarks from János Bertok, Acting Director of the Public Governance Directorate of the OECD, who will set the scene and introduce linkages between recovery phase and infrastructure. Before entering into the discussion with the panelists, we will have two polling questions where we will ask you participants to share your views. The answer to this question will also support to frame the discussion with the panelists. Then the panel will follow a panel structure. So panelists will be invited to give 5 to 6 minute presentation. And I will then enter into a moderated discussion and ask a number of questions to the different panelists. The last segment of the webinar will be devoted to question and answer coming from the participants, where panelists will be invited to share their views or experience or thoughts about how infrastructure planning could support the recovery phase. And finally, the meeting will be closed by Thomas Barrett, Chair of the Forum on the Governance of Infrastructure, who will deliver closing remarks. Before turning on to János, I will just briefly introduce you the panel. We have the chance to have an impressive panel today, starting with Lisa Mitchell. Lisa is Senior Director, Investment Partnership and Innovation at Infrastructure Canada, based in Ottawa. Lisa's team acts as a center of expertise on innovative approaches to infrastructure development, particularly on alternative approaches to funding, financing, as well as planning and delivery. And she is focusing on opportunities for partnership with the private sector to deliver public infrastructure. Welcome, Lisa. We also have the chance to have Pedro de Abreu, who is the member of the Brazilian Senior Executive Career since 1998. He is currently Deputy of the Special Secretary for Foreign Affairs of the Office of the Chief of Staff of the Brazilian Presidency of the Republic. The Special Secretariat of Foreign Affairs is responsible for coordinating Brazilian accession process to the OECD. Hello, Pedro. We also have the pleasure to count on George Katapodis. George is, since 2016, the chairman of the Hellenic Single Public Procurement Authority, the public procurement regulator in Greece. And since December 2019, he has been elected co-chair of the Working Party on PPPs of the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe. Hi, George. We also have the pleasure to count on Mark Enzer, who leads the National Digital Twin Program in the UK and is the chair of the Digital Transformation Task Group in Project 13. This project represents UK major infrastructure client organization. Mark is a keen champion of innovation in the context of collaborative delivery models, and he is particularly interested in the transformation of the infrastructure industry. Hello, Mark. And last but not least, we have the pleasure to count on Margaret O'Donnell, who is Assistant Principal in Investment Project and Programs Office of the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform in Ireland. She joined the Investment Projects and Programs Office in 2018 to work on the implementation of Project Ireland 2040, Ireland Long-Term Strategy for Public Capital Investment. It's a pleasure to have you, Margaret, as well. In the first two webinars, we have heard about experience and initial lessons learned from the immediate response to the crisis. In this third one, we will be looking ahead and trying to answer at what might look like infrastructure in the future. Will plans need to be changed to adapt to what will be considered a new normal? Before entering into the discussion with the panel members, I will now turn the floor to Janusz Bartok to deliver his opening remark. Janusz, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mathieu, and welcome everyone to this third edition of the series of webinars on infrastructure and public procurement responses to the COVID-19 crisis. Over 160 participants are following this live dialogue. Thank you so much for joining us for the more than 60 countries from all around the world. I particularly welcome the distinguished speakers for sharing your insights and shaping this global dialogue. Infrastructure, if done correctly, will have a crucial role to play in the recovery of our economies. The economic outlook released last week calls on addressing infrastructure shortages to improve living standards. Building back better our economies require a strong steer in policies to mitigate the lasting effects of the crisis. Infrastructure is no different. It will be about building better and smarter and not more. At the heart of a new OECD recommendation on the governance of infrastructure, strategic planning shapes the way infrastructure could contribute to this recovery. Strategic planning is the first lever of governments they have at hand. Planning is not just setting priorities. It influences how infrastructure is designed, delivered, and operated. It ultimately impacts our well-being for decades. The new recommendation on the governance of infrastructure supports countries in defining a new direction for infrastructure, which is fiscally sustainable with long-term strategic vision, ensures coordination within and across levels of government, and based on evidence and identified trade-offs. This webinar will discuss policy options to design and implement strategic plans. I'm very grateful for the speakers from countries revisiting their strategies to deliver infrastructure or discussing possible avenues to reframe investment strategies, such as Canada or Ireland. This dialogue today will shed light on the critical dimensions to support these commitments: collaboration, risk, financing, monitoring, and evaluation. We seek to answer the following questions. What are the most pressing objectives for infrastructure plans? How will infrastructure plans look like in the future? What elements will have the most influence on effective implementation of this new strategic vision? I'd like to thank you again for joining this dialogue. The OECD is your platform to shape this global debate. We look forward to your active participation and exchange of your inside experience. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Janusz, for setting the scene. Indeed, infrastructure project and the planning of this project will be at the heart of the recovery phase, and the very first step of planning indeed influence all the rest. Before turning on to the speaker, we would like to run 2 short questions and hear from you. So I will start with the first one. So this question will be open for 1 minute 30. The idea here is to understand from your perspective in a post-COVID context, what are the most pressing objectives upon which infrastructure plan should be designed? You can pick up to 3 choices in the response below. The first one is their environmental and social benefits and impact. The second, their affordability, or their readiness to be delivered, or the potential to introduce innovation benefiting end users. And finally, their resilience to future crises or shocks. So now it is up to you to choose what you think are the most critical objectives that should form infrastructure plan for the future. So a few additional seconds. And now we can display the results. So clearly, environmental and social benefits seems to be at the heart of what should be the basis for defining future infrastructure projects. Unsurprisingly, the resilience to future crises and shocks is also something that should be taken into account. And the three others are relatively close one to the other and seems to constitute lesser important priorities. Thank you. So now we will turn to the second question, which is now about the implementation of those plans and what would be the enabling factors that would contribute to the effective implementation of strategic infrastructure plans. So from your perspective, what are the elements that have or will have the most influence on the effective implementation of a strategic vision? Here again, you have the possibility to pick up to three choices in the different options below. The first one is the capability of stakeholders to deliver infrastructure projects. The second one is about rethinking the allocation of risk between the public and the private sector. The third is taking into account the impacts of individual projects on the whole infrastructure ecosystem. Having mechanism for effective coordination across level of government, or trying to disentangle infrastructure project from political cycle. And last, to leverage on digitalization to plan and implement projects. So again, here we would like to hear your views on what you think are the most critical elements that would support the effective implementation of a strategic vision. We'll again keep the poll open for a few additional seconds. And then I think we can close the poll and display the results. Interesting. So clearly, effective mechanism for coordination across level of government seems to be a priority, and that's probably understandable because many of the infrastructure projects are implemented at local level. But interestingly, we see also the question of capability arising, and I'm sure that this will echo some of the discussion that the panelists will have later on. And we're also seeing that for the others, their importance is relatively equal. So thank you very much for voting and for sharing your views on this. I'm sure that the panelists will pick up some of the results to frame the discussion and the ensuing conversation. So now I would like to start the conversation with the panel, and to start with Lisa. Lisa, Infrastructure Canada, and Canada as a government has engaged into a large infrastructure investment program for some years now. And maybe my first question to you would be, what are the consequences of the crisis? Did it accelerate anything? Did it change priorities? Or did it allow to have new conversation happening? So Lisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mathieu. And in Canada, it's good morning, but good evening and afternoon to everybody who's participating. And I think it's a really good question, Mathieu. I think for me to start with just a bit of a context around the Canadian situation, The federal government in Canada owns only about 2% of public infrastructure. 60% of public infrastructure in the Canadian context is owned by municipalities. So we play a role as significant funder of infrastructure priorities of other levels of government. Beginning in 2016, the government announced the Investing in Canada plan, which will seek to invest $187 billion over 12 years, and in 5 priority areas. One of the signature programs under that entire plan are what we call the integrated bilateral agreements, and that's a direct relationship between the federal government and the provinces and territories. One of the key factors of that program, which was a shift in the way we delivered infrastructure prior to, funding programs prior to, was it was very much driven by outcomes. It's an outcomes-based program, and it causes the provinces and territories to really start to think through multi-year plans. It's one of the requirements that they must submit to the federal government, is a multi-year plan that needs to be updated on an annual basis of the projects that they're going to prioritize for funding. So we've started to make the shift already in the Canadian context to that longer term planning. And in the integrated bilateral agreements, the municipalities have to work directly with the province or territory to seek their priorities to be added to the list. You know, I think like everybody else, when you turn into the current context, many people will look to things like infrastructure spending as a way to support the economy. But I think for us and many others, it's a bit of a different situation than maybe what we would have seen in 2008, 2009. You know, governments have had to make difficult decisions with their chief medical officers to shut down entire industries, but which has had an impact. But at the same point in time, construction has actually largely remained an essential service. It's not even, it's a prior provincial or territorial decision, but a large number of them continue to allow construction sites to operate. In the government's response thus far has really focused on income support, so programs that support small businesses, large businesses, small and medium-sized enterprises, workers, and Canadians as well too. And you know, we're slowly starting to open up our economy. It's not even across the board in the Canadian context. And as we slowly start to reopen, I think we need to start to think about what the impact of this current pandemic is, whether it be medium term, long term, and how that changes the way we view infrastructure. So I think there's a number of considerations that we really need to think about moving forward from our perspective. And you know, that formulates, I think, how you respond and how you look at infrastructure planning long term. You know, things like how the construction sector, you know, has adapted. Do they still have the capacity to exist, to continue to deliver not only current projects, but a pipeline of projects in the future? And are there opportunities for displaced labor in other sectors to maybe move over to the construction industry to support? How do they implement new health and safety rules? And can they continue to do that on a long-term basis? What are the potential opportunities or the necessities that social distancing brings? I think in addition, you know, there's been disruptions in the supply chain. How can the industry adapt to that? And are there areas that, you know, we can change the way we do things? Long-term planning, can engineering and design firms adapt their business models and their approaches to accommodate a work from home scenario so that we can continue to do that early work to get that continued pipeline? And, you know, for us in the Canadian context, there's been a large focus on this over the past 10 years or so, but, you know, where will private capital be? Where will their interests lie? What types of projects will they be looking to invest in? And are there voids that the public sector may need to fill? So we've already had a lot of infrastructure and construction activity because of the Investing in Canada plan for a number of years prior to this current situation that we're in. But I think there are opportunities for us to think a bit differently, take things that we've learned to date and adapt, evolve them. And I think one of the big things for us is, you know, defining that what to build. How do you know what are the right projects, what areas? And I think, as I mentioned earlier, the changes that the pandemic is bringing has completely changed the way people live and work. And how much of that is going to stay with us? How much of that is just temporary and will return to normal once the economy fully opens again? We've had a number of really successful examples and ongoing relationships of collaboration. As you know, Canada is a very large, very diverse country. We have urban municipalities, we have a lot of rural, we have mountains and ocean and prairie. And so no one region is dealing with the same set of issues. And there are examples of where multi-level government collaboration has been very effective. The Waterfront Toronto initiative is one example, and it's the federal government, the provincial government of Ontario, and the city of Toronto working together to revitalize about 800 hectares of Toronto's waterfront. And they're working together to try and find the most optimal solutions, but with a very distinct focus on reconnecting people with the waterfront, design excellence, sustainable development, economic development, as well as fiscal sustainability. So there's a really good example of 3 levels of government working together with a variety of responsibilities for delivering infrastructure in that space, but coming up with a plan that optimizes everybody's involvement. I think another really good example in the Atlantic provinces and the east coast of Canada, the 4 Atlantic provinces, their utilities, and the federal government have the Atlantic Clean Power Planning Committee. And that is really focused on enhancing the generation, transmission, and the use of clean power across the region. It's an area that still relies very heavily on coal. And there's an opportunity there as a coordinated effort to find the best way to deliver and contribute to climate change, the climate change agenda, in a way that makes sense and has everybody at the table speaking from in one voice. So I think that can help us define the what to build. We have the IBAs with the long-term plans that the provinces and territories and municipalities are working together with the federal government. We have regional opportunities where the levels of government involved for delivering infrastructure in certain regions can work together. But I think then that translates into once you know what your projects are, how do you build them? And we've got short term, which is projects that are moving forward even in the context of the pandemic. We've got projects and procurements that were to be launched that are continuing to move forward, and then the long-term vision. And again, in the Canadian context, the availability-based P3 and moving into the Canada Infrastructure Bank model, which is a revenue-generating concession model, is really an opportunity for us to think about at a coordinated table what projects might fit what models and how best to deliver those. But there are considerations there as well too. And as I mentioned at the outset, what will investor interest be after this? Are there particular asset classes that they're going to be wanting to focus on? And I know there's been a lot of discussions, even in some of your own webinars, about what exactly that might look like down the road. Unsolicited proposals is something that's new in the Canadian context. The Canada Infrastructure Bank has a mandate to take unsolicited proposals. The province of Ontario, which is Canada's largest market, now has an unsolicited proposals framework. It's new in the Canadian context, and I think that we're at the beginning stages, but there's a lot of opportunity that unsolicited proposals could bring as well too. And then I think private sector risk appetite. Prior to and over the past year, there's been a lot of discussion in Canada's P3 space about the rebalancing of risk in the availability-based model, in particular with respect to public transit. And I think that the private sector has raised some concerns and is working very closely with various levels of government to rethink how that balance of risk transfer is going to go moving forward. And so I think, that in addition to the emergence of the alliance or the IPD model as an alternative approach, very early stages in some markets in the Canadian context, but potential opportunity to see how these types of models fit into the long-term plan moving forward. And I think, you know, it's that partnership with the private sector, I think, will always be there. They are always going to build infrastructure in Canada, and continuing to find ways to partner with them for the long term, I think will be key.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Yeah, I'm glad that you brought the point on coordination across level of government. This is certainly something that we will come back to in the following discussion. And also, I'm pretty sure that the question you raised about the uncertainty around demand in the future and what it might imply, especially for those projects that would be privately financed, where that would be privately operated and based on, and where revenues are based on demand, is certainly something that is likely to be a challenge in the coming years, and will certainly ground some of the discussion around defining the best potential delivery model for infrastructure project. But as you mentioned, we also need to account for the public budget in those projects, and to try to find the right balance between publicly financed project and privately financed project. And in fact, this gives me a good opportunity to turn on to Pedro in Brazil, to share what is the current thinking in Brazil, and what are the current plans. The Brazilian government launched very recently a program which heavily draws on infrastructure as a mean also to encourage regional development. So Pedro, would you be kind enough to share with us what are the latest thoughts in Brazil around this program, and what challenges you might see ahead in terms of planning infrastructure program and make sure that they are properly implemented? Pedro, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mathieu. It's a great opportunity for me to be here and to talk a bit about the latest Brazilian program, considering the recovery of the economy, and also the infrastructure sector, as you said, is a very important part of this program. So I'm going to talk a bit about the Brazilian recovery program, which is called Pro Brasil in Portuguese. Basically, it's a program that sets forth the most important investment plans, the most important projects, socioeconomic projects, which comprises naturally the infrastructure projects for the coming 10 years. Let me start by giving you a bit of a context of what was happening before this program was launched. We have in Brazil a very big investment gap in infrastructure, as you might know. We're a very big country, the fifth in terms of territorial extension in the world. We've got a huge population, the fifth in the world also. And we have huge infrastructure needs. In spite of that, of those very pressing investment infrastructure needs, the amount of investment in this country regarding infrastructure is tiny, less than 1% of GDP, which sometimes not even sufficient for the depreciation rates. So there's a pressing need to increase the investment in infrastructure in the country. The problem is that we can't use public budget for that, because even before the pandemic in Brazil, we were running very tight fiscal policies naturally that were leading to a pressing need for fiscal responsibility in the country. And I say that because historically in Brazil, we've got a history of expenditures, fiscal policies and expenditures increasing as a percentage of GDP since the 1980s. So the current government was running very tight fiscal policies, trying to bring fiscal responsibility as one of our main economic policy priorities. So that was before the pandemic. So when the pandemic comes, as you all know, we took emergency measures, which were targeted first towards the vulnerable population, but also we tried to give credit to the enterprises and try to maintain the employment levels in the country. So as a result of that, our fiscal situation got worse. So that was the immediate effect, of all those emergency programs that we had to launch in Brazil. And that was the context in which our program called Pro Brasil is launched, and pretty much explains a lot of its main features. So Pro Brasil was formulated basically to integrate, prioritize different projects that are going on across different ministries in Brazil. And the main goal, the main focus is to enable a very fast recovery, the fast creation of jobs in the fastest way as possible, using a lot the private sector because of all the fiscal situation that I talked about earlier. And so the idea is to use the private sector as much as possible. The program basically has two main dimensions, and these two dimensions, they're based on the motto of our national flag, which is order and progress. So the first dimension is called order, and it's basically focused on projects related to the business environment. So we would like to have in this dimension projects that increase the legal certainty, that increase legal judicial certainty, that contribute for the transparency of norms and laws, all those initiatives that reduce transaction costs, to sum it up. Regarding the progress dimension, this dimension is related to investments, which involves all those public works using the national budget. But as I told you, the idea is to use as much as possible the partnerships with the private sector. So this dimension also is we would like to stimulate as much as possible the partnerships with the private sector. So what we have done now is that we created criteria of priorities for these two dimensions that I talked to you about. So regarding, for example, the progress dimension, which is related to the public works and the partnerships with the private sector for the constructions, the main criteria established, we're looking for projects that have the potential of creating jobs, for this idea of creating a rapid recovery of the economy as fast as we can. We're looking for projects that generate direct benefits for the population. So, and that is totally in line with the polls that have just been showed by Mathieu. And we're also looking we're going to give priority to the ongoing projects. So the idea is to have focus and to try to finish all the projects first before starting new ones, because we have had here in Brazil a history of starting several projects without finishing them. So the idea now is to actually turn this over and to try to basically finish what we have been doing first before starting new projects. So that's the main logic concerning this progress dimension that I'm talking about. Considering now the order dimension, which is targeted towards the business environment, we're going to give priority to all those projects that contribute to the Doing Business Index, and also very important here to this audience here, we're going to give priority to the projects that contribute as much as possible to the convergence to the OECD's instruments and best practices. So that because actually accession to the OECD is one of our main policies here in Brazil. So we're trying to link that to the order that I mentioned, prioritizing projects that have this in mind. You know? So to sum it up, the pandemic actually has not taken Brazil off track. And I say that because actually the main government program of the current government, which is called O Caminho da Prosperidade, still applies. But what the pandemic has done is that actually it has, because of the pandemic, Brazil has taken very rapid and fast emergency measures targeted to the most needed population. And it has made us prioritize, accelerate, focus, use the private sector as much as possible towards the projects coming that will contribute to this sustainable development. So that's what the pandemic has done, and that's the whole logic of the Pro Brasil program that I'm talking about. So and very important also.
Thank you,
we
Pedro.
have a,
just sorry to interrupt,
yeah.
But you touched upon something which I believe will be interesting for the discussion, is the question of progress, as you mentioned, but also the question of sustainable development goals, SDGs. And it is true that in many countries there are initiatives that try to indeed leverage on infrastructure projects to pursue and to attain SDGs. So we will come back later to the discussion with you, Pedro. But I just wanted to benefit from the point you made and the interesting point you made there to turn on to George Katapodis. So George, you as a co-chair of the Working Party on PPPs of the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, how do you see privately financed projects being implemented, and at the same time, as Pedro just mentioned, pursuing and trying to achieve SDGs? Do you think that we can use the good old same model, or do you think that we will need to invent something new? George, the floor is yours.
Bonjour tout le monde. Good morning, everyone, or good evening. Here in Greece, it's about 4 o'clock evening time. Well, the obvious economic consequence of the pandemic outbreak create an extra need for bigger public expenditure in order to support economic recovery and growth, especially in Greece, which, as you know, recently emerged from a long and difficult period of recession. Investing in infrastructure projects creates an increased multiplier for the economy, a multiplying effect, and will lead to better levels of employment and contribute hopefully to GDP growth. As a new era is emerging, leaving the COVID crisis hopefully behind, and we hope that we are all, through with it, increased coordination and flexibility in public procurement systems seems to be necessary, while most countries, in order to mitigate the negative effects on growth, are trying to accelerate the pace of infrastructure development and also identify projects which can provide immediate benefits. The Greek government, along with the main stakeholders, are having an extended discussion about simplifying, first of all, and renewing the framework of the execution of public contracts. We also need to confront the pandemic's challenges and meet the need for social distancing and also the implementation of the digital transformation of the public sector, which is very crucial also for the present government in Greece. The impact of the COVID-19 crisis on public works, I think, is evident. In Greece, since the outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic and the imposition of a full lockdown on most businesses, the public procurement system has had to deal with unprecedented and major challenges. Admittedly, of course, public works contracts were only indirectly affected, mainly due to their long-term maturity time. What are the next steps with respect to infrastructure planning and the acceleration of infrastructure investments? Many countries and Greece are looking for mature infrastructure projects to support economic recovery, and will be also investing in infrastructure-led recovery programs. And this is where I believe a new era emerges. The new partnerships are coming up front, and also we need a new approach, the so-called people-first approach, which I believe could be considered as a best practice. People-first PPPs ensure that people are at the epicenter. The focus is on improving the quality of life in communities, particularly those which are fighting poverty, by creating local and sustainable jobs. The aim is to fight hunger, promote well-being, gender equality, access to water, energy, transport, and education for all. To promote, in other words, social cohesion, justice, and also reject all forms of discrimination. Therefore, PPPs contribute to achieve most of the so-called UN Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, through the so-called 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and also improve projects on time and on budget, because these are two very important factors. And this is also a big part of our work within the UN Economic Cooperation for Europe Working Party on PPPs. To this end, people-first PPPs can also help governments focus on projects which deliver sustainable outcomes, and also help mobilize private financing and innovation capabilities in SDG compliant projects, and thereby overcome altogether the insufficient financial flows. Private sector investors have obviously economic and financial metrics to evaluate projects, but most of them lack adequate tools to measure the project's social and environmental impacts, and this is very important. To conclude, I will say that partnerships with the private sector play a critical role in supporting governments' efforts for prevention, preparedness, and response to crises like the current pandemic. We have to harness both company skills, management capabilities, and technology. And in this line, I would totally agree with what was said by my previous predecessors, both from Canada and from Brazil. As for Greece, private investment on infrastructure should be thoroughly encouraged. Indeed, in Greece, we don't have only 1% of our GDP in infrastructure, we have a much larger part. During the coronavirus crisis, our country emerged as one of the most vulnerable countries in the Eurozone due to the low productivity of our economy, and also to the unfavorable demographics. It is therefore necessary to leverage new resources in order to achieve a new and sustainable development dynamic in the field of public procurement. It is imperative that concessions and PPPs be used more widely, especially as a means to attract private investments under a people-first perspective, what we call the people-first perspective. We need to focus on certain planning issues, such as land use, spatial and urban planning, environmental impact assessment, and so on. Finally, last but not least, digitalization of the public procurement system, redesigning of the main financial instruments, and simplification, rationalization of the public procurement framework, considering the constraints brought about by the pandemic, should be among our immediate goals. And we at the Hellenic Public Procurement Authority are most certainly putting up specific proposals to that end. Concluding, I would just emphasize on why we need for a new approach to the PPPs for the SDGs. Basically, according to the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, we have called for the promulgation of a new guidelines for appropriate structure of PPPs. The objective is to mobilize investment in infrastructure and public services. What is at stake? Well, basically to fill what we call the infrastructure gap while complying with the SDGs. The challenges are many, and basically we have to have a PPP model, not like the traditional one, but a PPP model that is not fit for purpose, which is fit for purpose for the SDGs. The solution is quite simple, I believe. It's to adopt a new model that focuses on not only on what we call value for money, but also and mainly of what we call value for people, the people-first approach. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, George. Quite interesting that you mentioned indeed that in terms of for having effective infrastructure plans, you also need to think about the framework conditions and the enabling factor, and mentioning indeed the role of public procurement in delivering those projects, and the need to find and to adapt also those frameworks to make sure that the right projects are delivered. Also very interesting the point you make about the people first approach and the change that might be brought indeed by the by the current crisis in terms of objective. I recall the results of the polling question and the clear focus on environmental, social consideration in trying to design infrastructure plans and try to define strategic planning of infrastructure projects. So thank you very much. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions related to that, and I again invite all participants to share any question they might have to the panelists using the chat function. But I'm using this opportunity also to turn to Mark, because I'm sure that the people first approach somehow resonate with some of the elements that the industry is also looking for and seeing in the infrastructure realm, and this user-centric approach to think might be the beginning of something more radical change. So Mark, if you could share with us what the industry is looking for in terms of the future we want, precisely in the quote you made. So we would be grateful to hear from you. What is the private sector? How is the private sector seeing these changes? Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Mathieu. And I very much agree with what Georgios was saying there on the people-focused approach. I think that has to be right. The angle that I'd like to introduce here really is that about having a clear vision, because I think that as we do emerge from the crisis and as we put together plans for recovery, that there's obviously a real need to focus initially on just getting going again, on the kind of the restart and reset stages. But I think that if we don't consider the future that we want, then we'll only get the future that we get. And so I think it's absolutely essential for us to consider what future we do want, to articulate a really clear vision, because then it gives all the actions that we take now a purpose, a meaning, and a direction. And so I think it's essential for us as a broader industry to understand what that vision is. And I would suggest that in addition to that people focus, we should also have a systems-based vision of the future, so that we're not just looking at the construction of new assets, but we're looking at what we've already got, so that we recognize the system, so that we can get more out of what we've already got, so that, as was said earlier on, we can build smarter and better, not just more. And so I think one of the first things that we have to do is recognize the system. We have to see that what we have built for ourselves is a system of systems. Not just in economic infrastructure, but also across social infrastructure and the interface with the natural environment. It's the most amazingly complex machine that humans have built. But very often we don't see it as that. What we see it as is a series of construction projects. So I think one of the first things for us to do is actually to recognize the system of systems, because then we can start to see system solutions to system problems. And one of the really big examples of that I guess we see at the moment would be net zero, but I could mention a lot of others: circular economy, resilience. Even as we try to move towards optimizing outcomes from the overall built environment, what we need to see is that all of these are systemic issues and they demand system-based solutions. They cannot be solved in silos. And so I think it's essential that we recognize the system of systems. But then in recognizing that, if we can go to the next slide, please, then we need to see people at the heart of that. And I think this speaks directly to Georgios's point, that really the whole point of this machine that we've built is to serve people. You know, we want people and society to flourish. And therefore we kind of need to redraw our processes based around people. And so I see that the use of the infrastructure is absolutely at the center, because that's why we need the infrastructure, so we can use it. It's the services we get from the infrastructure. So if that's at the center, then we can see operation maintenance as those processes which have to go on forever that enable the use. And then also we can see our projects in that context. They're really important. In the UK, it's something like 9% of GDP. But really what those are interventions on the system that enable the system to work better, to deliver the services that then enable the outcomes that we want. So I think that we need this people-focused, system-based view of infrastructure, and that should be part of our vision going forwards. And then when we have that vision, and if we can go on to the next slide, please, we can start to see how some of the solutions can work out. And there's not time to go into a lot of them, but one that I would really want to pull out is the opportunities that we now have in digitalization of the system. And we can start to imagine how we can apply Industry 4.0 thinking to infrastructure. And so we can then start to see it as a cyber-physical system. And then we can start to use the tools of cyber-physical systems, like digital twins, connected digital twins, to unlock value. And we know that that unlocks value from other sectors. And it's been proven in manufacturing and aerospace. So now we have to apply this to infrastructure. But I don't think we can do this unless we see the system and unless we're focused on delivering the outcomes for people. So I would just really want to emphasize some of the things that have been said before. If we want to have a desirable future, we need to define it, and then we can work towards it. And so let's understand that desirable future and produce a clear, coherent, compelling vision that is both people-focused and systems-based. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark. Quite fascinating. And if I hear you well, no infrastructure is an island, and we need to consider indeed the whole system and the impact on users. And well, as you mentioned, if we want to have a desirable future, we need to invent it and design it. That's certainly the case, and I believe that many of the interventions so far clearly pointed out to the need to rethink the current plans and to revisit the way those plans are designed. But what we do need also is people and institutions capable to deliver on those plans, so that they are effectively implemented. And that gives me the opportunity to turn on to Margaret. Margaret in Ireland. So I know that you have an ongoing, again, capital expenditure program that is ongoing to the Project Ireland 2040. But has the COVID crisis changed some of the focus of this plan? And more importantly, how do you go about the making sure that the institution that would be ultimately responsible to deliver on those plans are capable of doing so? So Margaret, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. Hello from a rainy Dublin today. At the outset, let me thank the OECD for inviting me to participate in today's webinar, and I'd like to, I suppose, provide the Irish perspective on this important topic. My own role in the Investment Projects and Programmes Office relates to the implementation of Project Ireland 2040, which, as you say, Matthew, is Ireland's long-term strategy for public capital investment. I'd like to focus on three key messages today. Firstly, and very importantly, the Irish government plans to maintain capital investment levels. We've learned lessons from the last crisis when capital investment was drastically reduced. Secondly, we're facing a big challenge at the moment in terms of future strategic planning for infrastructure in light of a draft programme for government, which has just been published by the incoming government this week, and this will have some major implications for infrastructure planning going forward. And lastly, the third point I'd like to make is in relation to, in the public service, we need to focus on making the most effective use we can of capital budgets, considering the deficits we're all facing at the moment. And in particular, we need to shine a light on building capability in infrastructure delivery. So firstly, for some context on the Irish situation, just go back in time a little. As you know, Ireland experienced a deep recession triggered by the global financial crisis that began in 2008 and 8. As a result of that, public finances had to be put on a sustainable path. And as a result, there was a significant reduction in investment in infrastructure in Ireland. I suppose probably at the time we were facing a very large deficit, and infrastructure and capital spending was probably seen as an easier target at the time. But that has had consequences for us, and the infrastructural gap that has emerged from this underinvestment held back the rate of economic growth and also impeded quality of life improvements, which have been referred to earlier. For example, long commuting times, for instance, has affected work-life balance for many, and we've also had problems around the very entrenched structural issues around housing, investment in healthcare, etc. And to address these critical issues, in 2018, the Irish government launched Project Ireland 2040. It's a long-term strategy for public investment, and it's composed of two elements. Firstly, a national planning framework. This is the government's blueprint to promote regionally balanced, compact and sustainable growth. And secondly, a national development plan covering a 10-year period, 2018 to 2027, involving total public capital investment of 116 billion euros over the lifetime of the plan. And for the first time, our long-term spatial strategy was aligned with the capital investment plan. So we moved away from the approach of the past, which saw public investment spread too thinly and investment decisions that didn't align with a well thought out and defined spatial strategy. And to give you a sense of the scale of investment that was involved, in 2019, public investment in Ireland increased by 24%, up to 3.5% of national income. And in 2020, there was planned investment of a further 11%, which would have brought it up to 4% of national income. And comparing, that's there's an EU average of about 2.9%. So in the pre-COVID world, considerable progress has been made in ramping up the public capital stock and eliminating the barriers to continued expansion. However, there's an emerging consensus that the nature of this crisis is different to that of the financial crisis of 2008, and that a different policy response on capital is called for this time. As I mentioned at the start, the government is committed to continuing infrastructure investment. Previously, cutting capital may have been seen as an easier option to reduce deficits. But we've learned those lessons where severe retrenchment of public investment led to suboptimal outcomes for citizens, I suppose, in a lot of cases. And indeed, public investment is even more important now, as well as boosting the supply side of the economy. It's an important stimulus at a time when economic activity has fallen very sharply. And in this sense, accelerating the delivery of key projects will ensure that construction activity is stimulated, as well as delivering homes, schools, and all the other next infrastructure that is essential for citizens. The second topical issue for Ireland is the draft programme for government published this week. It has major implications for capital investment in Ireland in terms of composition and direction. And it's an ambitious plan which will require huge agility from the public service and flexibility and innovation to implement. We had already planned to have a review of our National Development Plan in 2022. However, we're bringing this forward to ensure alignment with the new programme for government. But there's also an opportunity to think strategically and innovatively about meeting our core national policies on spatial planning, climate, and also tackling the response to COVID. But importantly, this review isn't going to hold up on any projects in the interim. It's expected there will be a short period of re-evaluation, and we might also look at some prioritization of projects in order to better balance projects that enhance the supply side more in the longer term with shovel-ready projects that can deliver an immediate economic impact. The final area I'd like to touch on is the subject of capability and the public service to deliver infrastructure. Even before the present crisis, we had already been looking at this. We had commissioned a review of capability of the public sector to deliver the National Development Plan. We see this as a crucial element in delivering infrastructure over the longer term. And the rationale for the review is to assess, I suppose, whether government departments and agencies had the capacity and capability and appropriate governance structures to efficiently deliver projects, or whether global best practice models need to be explored. Some of the reasoning for the review as well came from the point of view that some departments and agencies now have very large capital budgets, whereas they would have been drastically reduced in the time of the recession. So there's been a loss of skills, perhaps, and capabilities across sectors, and we need to do something to address this. So the review underway will assess whether project delivery capacity or governance gaps exist, or where inefficiencies have been identified, and then try and identify some solutions and strategies which optimize project implementation. We expect this review to be completed in mid-August, but I can share some early findings today just before I finish. We've identified challenges in attracting and retaining staff, which is probably common to a lot of jurisdictions. There needs to be more knowledge sharing across the public sector, especially among those who are at the coalface of project delivery. More emphasis needed on stakeholder management and communication. There's also a lack of common or consistent approach taken by entities, even with similar projects or programs. How do we balance also between local delivery of projects and adopting a centralized approach? And it may also be pointing to a gap in leadership capability for end-to-end delivery of projects. So we're expecting the review to be finished in August. So the recommendations will form a key input into our review of the capital spending plan going forward. That's all from me, Matthew. But in conclusion, just say that there's a need now more than ever to deliver enhanced public capital investment. And I think forums like this, where we can share ideas and strategies, would be very useful for that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Margaret. That was clearly, you provided a number of compelling arguments indeed for shifting some of the priorities and reflecting on what the new reality means. In fact, I was about to start with a few questions, but we have had an interesting question from the audience that I would like to ask. Maybe something which is a bit I wouldn't say radical, but which might trigger some different views, and that might be directed to Mark or to Giorgio. We have a question from the European Institute of Public Administration, and the question is basically asking, since value for money in the traditional sense should, in your views, be no longer the only focus and the sole focus of when planning infrastructure project, and there should be also a value for people and this consideration taken into consideration. So the participant is asking, don't you think that there might be at one point some conflict or tensions between value for money and value for people? Who wants to respond to that?
I'll have a go. I have to confess to being an engineer, not an economist, so some of the terminology I might use might not be completely correct. But I think the issue of value is incredibly important in all this, and it strikes me that if we buy that vision where infrastructure really is all about people and society and outcomes, then that means that the outcomes we desire will be some kind of combination of environmental, economic, and social outcomes, and that should be a matter of discussion and debate, so that we understand where we want the balance to lie. But then if we understand what kind of outcomes we are aiming for, then really value should be defined in terms of those outcomes. I guess, putting it crudely, looking at how many of those outcomes we get per pound or per dollar. So I think that the value for money issue shouldn't really just be seen at an individual project level, where what is being targeted there are simply outputs, and those projects become interventions on a bigger system. What we really need to see is that bigger value of outcomes.
Thank you, Mark. Quite probably a clear answer to that. But I see that Georgios and also Margaret wanted to intervene. So George, you have something to add to this? And again, just for the sake of continuing the conversation, please bear with me and try to limit your intervention to maximum 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mathieu. Basically, I think Mark said something very right. Even though he's not an economist, he's really thinking like an economist. The idea is about value, and let me say something very obvious and evident. Till very recently, the main factor for deciding procurement projects, whether this was public services, goods, or infrastructure, was the so-called lower price. And that's when basically we started to having this discussion about whether we should have the price at focus, therefore the value of the tender at focus, or something else. So when we started talking about value for people instead of value for money, I think it depicted, the shift from the cost perspective of projects to a perspective which did not include only cost. So in that sense, there is not necessarily a conflict between value for money and value for people. But what we want to say and to portray with this value for people approach was that basically we're moving from a cost, and an economic appraisal of projects towards a more complete and concrete notion involving other factors than cost. And when deciding a tender, tender awarding, which infrastructure also tenders, we should not only bear in mind the costs of the projects, but other factors like environmental impact, like social impact, and other factors. That's the idea of value for people. It's not that we are having people like versus money. It's not that. That was not the idea. So that's basically what I want to say. Thank you.
Thanks, George, for making that clear. And Margaret, you wanted to add something?
Yes, thank you, Matthew. Yeah, I agree with George, the previous speaker there. I didn't see value for money and value for people as being mutually exclusive events. They can go hand in hand, I think. In our own Project Ireland 2040, it was developed around a set of 10 national strategic outcomes. So it was very much outcomes based for the citizen around things like access to childcare, etc., access to education. And we're at the moment developing a set of impact indicators which will assess the results for citizens of the measures that have been taken so far. And just as a final point, this is very much in the space we're thinking of here, as in I mentioned our draft programme for government, which has been published this week. And it talks very early on about developing a set of well-being indices for the country and citizens, and obviously infrastructure would be part of that. I suppose it's getting away from the purely economic measure of success of projects and having a more, I suppose, people-centred version, and something that is more accessible and understandable by the average citizen. So yeah, that's my contribution. Thank you.
Thanks, Margaret. Yeah, very good point and very clear point. But in fact, I would like to follow up on this discussion around value, whether it's value for money or value for people. And indeed, the two might not be contradictory, but might complement themselves. And I would have a question, because here we are talking about planning. So I understand that from your perspective and the perspective of the different panelists, when planning infrastructure project, these notion of value for people should be integrated, and should, if I hear you correctly, should also somehow preside on the choice and project selection and the choice of project that will move forward. We know that in the reality, infrastructure projects are planned, designed, and delivered and operated by different stakeholders. It's not the same entity that decides on planning, that then is responsible for constructing the infrastructure, and then is responsible for operating the infrastructure. And I just took Lisa's point and Pedro's point about the importance of ensuring a life cycle approach to infrastructure projects. So my question to all of you, but maybe Lisa, you would like to say something on that, is what kind of coordination mechanism needs to be put in place to make sure that the initial assumption that were taken at the planning phase of infrastructure project indeed effectively materialize through construction and through operation of infrastructure project?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Mathieu. And I think, one thing that we've really focused on in the Canadian context, in particular with our availability-based P3 market, is our value for money analysis, and really looking at, robust qualitative, quantitative inputs, market soundings to really determine whether that model is going to be the best approach for the long term. That's the beginning part, and it's heavy work. It's a lot of people and gathering a lot of data to input, but the management of a performance-based contract through the duration is also key. How do you keep track of construction milestones? How do you keep track of operation and maintenance progress throughout, as well as sort of refurbishments and life cycling of assets? So the management of a performance-based contract has been key, and capacity has been, there's always a question of capacity. For many communities, a large availability-based P3 may be a once in a lifetime or once in a generation type project, but we've benefited from procurement agencies at the provincial and territorial level, and we now have at the federal level the Canada Infrastructure Bank, which isn't a procurement agency but has a role in providing advice and support to communities that are looking at engaging. And I think what we're also looking at with the emergence of the Alliance and the IPD, as well as in smaller rural and remote communities, is how can we take the lessons that we've learned through the availability-based model, which does factor in the life cycle approach, and apply that to traditional build. How can we get better at asset management? We have a lot of small municipalities across the country and capacity to keep track of these things. And so what are the types of things we're working with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities on an asset management program for that very reason, to support those? So I think, regardless of procurement model and regardless of relationship with the private sector, from beginning through to the end of the life cycle of an asset, there are lessons that can be applied regardless. And we're really trying to tie that back in a lot of ways. I think we benefit from a very open dialogue between, in the P3 space, between the public and the private sector. And so that, collaborative approach to be able to shift models and apply them as needed based on a set of principles, I think has been really important for the success of our market.
Thanks, Lisa. And yeah, indeed, the open dialogue and making sure that communication lines remain open, not only between the public and the private sector, but also, as you mentioned, between different layers of government, is certainly one of the critical success factor for those projects to be delivered. Pedro, considering the structure of Brazil is a federal system as Canada, do you have anything to share on relationship between different level of government and between different institutions, and making sure that objectives are aligned?
Yes, Mathieu, as you know, Brazil is as you said, Brazil is a federal government. So of course we have articulation. We have a very important task of articulation among different entities, and the areas where actually we face most of our pressing needs for this articulation are basically the levels where actually the areas where the municipal governments have competencies, which are basic sanitation facilities, solid waste, and public lighting. So these are the areas in Brazil that where the municipal governments, they have the competencies to act. So at these areas, we have a very important role here at the federal government to promote the articulation between the different phases of the life cycle of the projects. One very important task that we have here at the federal government is giving actually the directions, making the planning, but also helping a lot at the municipal level with qualification in terms of how to make a project, how to deal with norms and all the complications that we have here in the federal government between the relationships of local norms and federal norms and state level norms. So basically how we act at the federal government is trying to help the municipalities in terms of building, showing them and qualifying them to build better projects, and also how to try to model the project in the best way as possible in financial terms. So that's basically how we act here at the federal government, and this action is basically happens in these three areas that I told you: basic sanitation facilities, solid waste, and public lighting.
Sorry, I realized that I was muted. So thank you very much for sharing this experience. I wanted to convey a question from the participants, and I'm sure that many of you will react to that. Question coming from Mexico, and saying that we are here talking about, as part of the option, attracting private finance and having private companies financing infrastructure project in the future. But person from Mexico is saying the private sector has been also severely hit by the crisis. And many of the companies are likely to face several financial damage from the crisis. And that comes back to the point on the uncertainty about demand that Lisa mentioned at the very beginning. So the question is, how do you expect that those very same companies will be willing to invest in infrastructure project, knowing that the uncertainty around the surrounding context might also increase risk on their side? So does any of you, well, I see Lisa willing to respond. So please, Lisa, your turn.
I think it's a really important question, and we have been in regular dialogue with the construction and design and engineering firm industry in Canada from the outset of the pandemic to get a sense of what they're dealing with. As I mentioned, in the Canadian context, there was not a one-size-fits-all approach to construction. It's really the domain of the provinces and territories to put those regulations in place, and in many cases it was deemed an essential service, but there was still an impact. Lower productivity, resulting in fewer people on site because of social distancing, disruptions in supply chain, whether it be interprovincial or international trade that was causing the disruption. And so I think there is a lot of dialogue that needs to continue. I think Selim Ben Smail, back in the very first webinar that you hosted, was quite right. When he made the comment that we don't know the full impact of this yet. We're slowly starting to reopen our economy here in Canada. It's uneven again across the country. but we do still need to monitor. And I think one of the things that the government did at the outset in its economic response plan, as I mentioned, was looking at income support. So there are programs in place for a number of businesses of varying sizes, open to the construction industry as well too. But we'll need to continue to dialogue, and we'll need to continue to monitor. Thus far, things look positive, but I think the longer the situation extends, and if there is to be any changes and we have to close our economies again, there will be an impact. So we'll continue to dialogue with them. We'll continue to dialogue with the provinces and territories that are also having their own conversations, but it is something that still needs to be watched.
Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, very interesting. I see that George wants to add something. We're slightly running behind schedule, so be conscious of time. So, but please, George, your turn.
I think that we have to see something which is quite important. This crisis, which was a crisis of huge impact, also created, I believe, what we could say a window of opportunity. And I explain myself. Basically, I think the timing now is perfect to support what we could call a well-structured and carefully costed plan for a new generation of big infrastructure projects, following certain rules, of course, and restrictions of the recovery programs. Greece and others, and any other country could reclaim, new monetary tools, in order to support what we would call a viable vision. Obviously, the problem is how you prioritize and how you create what we call within the UN system a pipeline of projects. Well, we have come down, at least the Greek government has come down to a series of projects they believe that should come first. And when you plan and then you prioritize, also you create the means to attract investment. And basically the main fields where we have focused is the transportation sector, is also the power installations, the water supply, the waste management. So these are a few of the sectors where we have, where the Greek government is putting, the emphasis and basically the focus for the next, infrastructure projects in Greece. And I think this is basically the question: how you do it, how you prioritize, and how you create the projects that will attract private investment. Thank you.
Could I just add?
Yeah, please, Pedro, but really short again.
Yeah, I'm really sorry. I was trying to raise my hand, but I messed something up here on my laptop. Just to add, I think it's a very good question. Governments have been trying to help the private sector all over the world, and coordination and communication is essential. I agree, but at the end of the day, I mean, the money has to go somewhere. And just to say that here in Brazil, we're really optimistic regarding the infrastructure projects. We have some very great opportunities for investment in highways, railways, concessions. We are privatizing our harbors. We have huge public tenders in the oil and gas sector. We have a very favorable exchange rate at the moment. The interest rate is very low. We have a huge and growing internal market here in Brazil that will probably attract a lot of investment. We're running sound economic policies, and we're differently from other countries. We're opening to the world. And so just to sum it up, we're looking for partners and investors, and we have a lot to offer, in spite of the economic situation nowadays.
Thanks, Pedro. In fact, we're discussing and trying to answer this question coming from Mexico, but I see that Mark has his hand raised. So maybe interesting to hear also from the private sector on this question. Mark.
Yeah, thank you. I hear the arguments, and I see that there would be kind of a focus on building some stuff and getting the industry going. But I think we can't forget that there's also climate change happening, and that net zero is a serious challenge. And so I think that we can't just assume that the right answer is to build a lot more of the same things which we've been building before. I think we need to recognize that some of the answer sometimes will actually be to build less. or at least to build different, or to build clever, maybe to build digital twins, maybe to build different things which give better outcomes without using so much concrete and steel. So I think that there's a real challenge here that while we definitely want to see this recovery, I feel it is important that we have defined that vision so we know what it is we're trying to build, and not just assume that we're building the same stuff that we built before. And I think that there's huge opportunities in this. I don't see this as being a poor choice, because as we do build a more circular economy, it offers all sorts of new and interesting jobs. I just don't think that we should assume that it would just be building the same things that we've built before.
Thanks, Mark. So yeah, if I understand correctly, then the part of attracting private financing also come with building differently or approaching the infrastructure project differently.
Well, definitely building the right things, because there's no point in trying to attract finance into building the wrong thing.
Yeah, thank you for this point. Look, we have too many questions for the time remaining coming from the participants. So I believe that the conversation with all of you has been very informative for the participants. We will pick the question and share them with you, members of the panel, later on, so we can follow up with the participant and share relevant experience based on the question. I would like to thank you very much all for this very interesting discussion. Before closing the webinar, I would also like to turn the floor to Tom. Thomas Barrett, who is the chair of the governance of the Forum on the Governance of Infrastructure, and who will do some short closing remark, maybe summarizing some of the key takeaways that he gathered from the discussion. Tom, the floor is yours. It seems you are muted, Tom.
Apologies.
Now it works.
Okay. Matthew, thank you very much for this discussion, and to all of the panelists and participants for a very rich discussion. Therefore, pulling it all together is a challenge, but let's try to do so rather quickly, building on a number of things we already share between us. I think the core comment of "this time it's different" is actually a relatively good description of where we are. And if it is different this time, it has implications for how we go forward. That means that we do not continue to do business as usual. And I suppose if I want to point out where the differences are, let's talk about the pressures on growth, particularly on long-term growth, that have now emerged that we did not have before. We clearly have much higher public as well as private sector debt burdens. We have monetary policy that is working on the assumption of low interest rates for long periods of time and low inflation. This may or may not prove to be realized. We have a rise clearly in political tensions and differences of approach emerging in some of the major economies and major economic blocs. We have a dilution of globalization, and we have, amongst other things, an increasingly aged infrastructure and increased aged population. Now, the point is being made, and I fully endorse it, that says we really do not know how and when we are going to get out of the COVID situation. But what we do know is that the requirements of meeting the key targets we have set for ourselves pre-COVID, as well as a result of COVID, of digitalization, of a green economy, a climate, but also picking up on issues that were evident pre-COVID, that government must establish greater trust and transparency in this whole area of investment. And there is also a need which has emerged for greater distribution within our economies, redistribution within our economies. All of these things are pointing to very substantially increased capital expenditure in new areas that we are exploring and models of which have yet to be developed. But I'd like to refer back to a study done by the World Bank about 2 years ago, when it looked at the potential cost of implementing the SDGs. And it said very simply, and forgive the simplification of what was a much more sophisticated study. It said very simply, it will cost approximately between 4% of gross domestic product and 8% of gross domestic product in each country to achieve the SDGs. And the key differences were as follows, as to which it would cost. One was the choice of demand policies that would impact the level of infrastructure required. Those countries who introduced demand policies found they had much less capital investment to make. The second point that they said was really making a difference was the organizational capacity and expertise of the public sector, but also of the private sector. That basically how much money you required depended on how skillful and how thoughtful you were in seeking to develop and to deliver your overall strategic objectives. Now, something else has emerged that we'll take it as a positive side effect of COVID, and there are not necessarily any or many such positive side effects. I think all of us have been extraordinarily surprised by the flexibility shown in the organization and delivery of medical services and their ability to create capacity where previously such capacity was not considered possible within periods of years. The second thing we have seen is an extraordinarily expansive use of public sector and government communications as a means of establishing what we will call norms of behavior. And that again impacted on the total capacity required, the total investment, and the ability to achieve results. Now, I fully take on board that one of the lessons which has been brought out, I think, by Georgios, by Mark, by others, on the PPPs for people type of principle or infrastructure for people. Very clearly, that is a central focus in many countries and will remain so. Let's be frank, however. If we go back to the OECD framework for governance of infrastructure, and we go back to the PPP principles already established, those concepts were already there. What we did not have were the specific metrics to push in certain areas. And I think what we are now facing is the dual challenge of seeing that the capital requirements to meet the totality of objectives we have vastly increased. The medium-term public and private sector capacity, by virtue of indebtedness and other constraints, has also, I think, found a ceiling or found a limit, even though it may be a limit that is much higher than what we previously thought it was. And that what we need in order to negotiate between what are our toughest and most important priorities and what are our resources is actually strengthened public sector and private sector capacity and smart decisions. Now, I'll finish with one point which is already, I'm afraid, rather telling. When the UN Secretary General spoke to the UN General Assembly last September, on the state of progress on the SDGs. He said to people, congratulations on the progress you have made, but by the way, the progress you are making is significantly behind what you needed to make in order to achieve these objectives. So we were already at a point pre-COVID that we had not achieved and were not achieving our overall objectives. I think what I'm pointing to is the need for smarter decisions, more effective decisions, both by public and private sector, as the solution we need to enhance to close this gap between the totality of resources required and indeed what even a lenient capital market solution tolerant of high indebtedness might allow us. I think, Matthew, that embraces, I think, everything that everybody has said. I think there is a great deal in the common picture that is emerging, and it is good to find that even in such a diverse group, we still have, I think, a rather strong mainstream narrative between us as to where the issues are and where potentially the solutions will lie. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tom, for having carried out the challenging exercise indeed to summarize some of the main takeaways and the main messages from the discussion. This discussion today will end very soon, but this is not the end of the conversation on infrastructure planning, but also more broadly on the governance of infrastructure and also procurement responses to the crisis. We all know that we are in a constantly evolving situation, so we will of course adapt and figure out, identify the main issues and the key topics to be discussed in future webinars. You can find already quite a lot of information on our website, notably the stock taking report on the immediate public procurement and infrastructure responses to COVID-19, which provides a quite comprehensive overview of countries' experience, OECD and non-OECD countries' experience in tackling this crisis. One big information that you can already pencil in your calendar is the forum on the governance of infrastructure, which will be held on the 29th and 30th October later this year. Many of the issues that were briefly touched upon today will be discussed further in depth, whether the question of digitalization, the question, as Mark pointed out, of building right projects. All those elements will be further discussed, and we are very much looking forward to try to set up an interesting and compelling conference and series of webinars on those topics. I would just like to finish by thanking sincerely all the panelists. Thank you very much for bearing with us, for sharing your experiences, but also your thoughts and views on how the future of infrastructure might look like. And on that, I wish you a good end of the day for those starting the day, or good beginning of evening for those ending the day. Thank you.